So today what I am wanting to do is start off by talking about the structure of the Bible. I would actually like to cover a little bit more than that today, if at all possible, because I'd like to keep us going a little bit quicker through this. But if we only cover the structure, that's okay, and we can save the rest for another week. But basically what we've been doing, this is, I believe, our 6th week for Apologetics so far. We did 1 week of general introduction to what is apologetics, and then we spent 4 weeks talking about the canon of the Bible. We spent 1 week on introduction to what is canon, another week on the Old Testament canon, and then 2 weeks on the New Testament canon. And basically what I'm wanting to do right now is give us just a building block foundation of what is the Bible and how did we get it, right? And if you remember back whenever I did our intro, I kind of gave an outline of what we were going to cover in this apologetics thing. And this all still belongs to what we would call Unit 1, right? How did we get the Bible? So, and the 5 main things that I'm wanting to address are the canon of the Bible, the structure of the Bible, the origin of the Bible, the transmission of the Bible, and the preservation of the Bible. So we've already spent a whole long time covering the canon, which is just the 66 books that we have in the Bible, how we got those books, and why they're there. And now what we're going to do is we're slowly but surely going to begin to move our way from the Bible as it was originally written to the Bible that we currently have. If you were to grab your Bible from right next to you, open it up and look at it. And so what we're going to look at next is the structure of the Bible. So now that we've actually looked at the 66 books that we have in our Bible, what I want to do is I want to kind of give you a broad overview of why those books are organized the way that they are when you flip to the table of contents and just look at them, right? And ultimately this might seem like something that's not super duper important in the long run, and really I guess it's not, but it's super helpful when it comes to just knowing your way around the Bible, right? And if you haven't noticed, one big thing that I'm trying to do when it comes to helping you defend your faith is I'm just trying to kind of give you an introductory primer to the faith, right? Just okay, let's start with, if everything that we believe is in the Bible, okay, well, let's figure out what the Bible is, why we have it, why it's structured the way it is. I want you to understand your Bible so that you know your way to work your way around it and you just know it really, really well, right? That's why we're spending so much time on this. And so, the structure of the Bible, the way we're going to start this is we're going to look at 3 things. We're going to first off look at the structure of the Hebrew Bible, then structure of the Old Testament, and then the structure of the New Testament. And you might hear me say that, and you might hear Hebrew Bible, and you might hear Old Testament, and you'll remember that whenever we talked about the canon of the Bible, I mentioned that those are the same thing. However, whenever it comes to how Jewish people actually organize their Bibles, they actually organize them a little bit differently than how we organize our Old Testaments. And so I do want to talk about that, mainly because I find it fascinating, and also because I actually kind of prefer it to how we structure our Old Testaments. And so I want you to understand how it was originally structured and how Jewish people structure it to this day. And then also I want to talk about why our Old Testament is structured the way it is. And so let's start with this, the structure of the Hebrew Bible, which, if you remember, we said is called Tanakh. Do you remember what Tanakh means? It was actually an acronym.
Nothing's ringing a bell in my mind.
It was an acronym. If you recall, we talked about this when we were looking at the Old Testament. It's TNK, right? If you remember, the Hebrew language does not have any vowels. Originally, they've added some since then, but even native Hebrew speakers, they don't use vowels whenever they write stuff down or anything. That's really just more to help us pronounce things. And so originally it's TNK, right? Tanakh, and it's an acronym that stands for Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim, right? And these are the 3 primary sections that you have of the Hebrew Bible. Torah means law, Nevi'im means prophets, and Ketuvim means writings, right? And so, in general, literally, you actually learn a little bit about the structure of the Hebrew Bible by simply knowing the name of it, the Tanakh, right? Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, TNK. In the Torah, there's 5 books. In the Nevi'im, there's 8 books. And in the Ketuvim, there's 11 books. If you do the math, how many does that add up to?
23.
Not 23. 24. Yeah, it adds up to 24. Yeah, just a little off. It adds up to 24. What's the issue there, though? How many books do we have in our Old Testament?
39.
39. Yes, we have 39 books in our Old Testament, but there's only 24 in the Hebrew Bible. And I'm just going to tell you right now, these actually account for the same material, the same content. They just structure it differently. And certain books that we would call one book, they actually compile together into a series of books that they call one book. And so we start with the first 5 books, the Torah, and this accounts for the first 5 books of the Bible, and this is actually the same as what we would call the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Right? In Hebrew, this is Bereshit, Shemot, Vayikra, Bemidbar, and Devarim. So the Hebrew Bible, they have different names for these books, and usually the names for these books are actually derived from the opening words of the books themselves. Right? So if you remember, the book of Genesis begins with what words?
In the beginning.
In the beginning. God. Yeah, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Right? Whenever you open up the Hebrew Bible, in Hebrew it says, Barashit bara Elohim. Right? In the beginning, God created. Okay, well, they call the book of Genesis Barashit. It means in the beginning. The word Genesis also means in the beginning, but that's taken from a different language. And so whenever you look at the Torah, you actually realize it's structured the same exact way that our Torah is, right? Except we usually call the Torah the books of Moses or the Pentateuch or something like that. But they organize that the same way. So for the first 5 books, you actually have the same structure going on there. And one thing I just want to highlight right off the bat here is that these books are in a classification all on their own. And whenever you actually read the New Testament, you'll notice that they reference the law more than basically anything else, right? And to be fair, sometimes law can be used more broadly speaking to speak of the entire scriptures, right? So even though the scriptures are called the Tanakh, sometimes they'll use the word Torah to refer to all of it. But more specifically, the Torah refers to the books of Moses, and you have to realize that these 5 books are the building blocks and the foundational tools of the entire Jewish belief system, right? For us, a lot of the times, just because, in all honesty, the way that we've kind of taught people to read the Bible, we've kind of taught them a more narcissistic approach to the Bible, to where we treat the Bible as something meant to entertain us. Whenever we read the Old Testament, we usually focus on the stories, right? So we really like Genesis, and then we really like the first half of the book of Exodus. But then all of a sudden, whenever you hit the back half of the book of Exodus, and Leviticus, and Numbers, and Deuteronomy, all of a sudden we start falling asleep when we're reading it, and we start wondering, what does this have to do with anything? Why should I care? And we usually skip over that, right? Or usually whenever somebody says, I'm going to read through the whole Bible in a year, they'll get through Genesis in the first half of Exodus, and then they'll start hitting the brakes when they get to the back half of Exodus, and that's where they start facing difficulties, because it starts getting really weird. And I think that's fair. However, you've got to realize that from a Jewish perspective, that's where things get extremely important. I actually have a Tanakh sitting in my room right over there. Whenever I film my YouTube videos, usually it's like sitting over behind me, over my left shoulder, sitting right there in front of the light. And this Tanakh, if you flip to the back of it, I actually pass it out amongst my students over at the school. If you flip to the back of it, there's a series of charts, right? And in most of our Bibles nowadays, if you flip to the back, there will be some charts and maps and stuff like that. But usually those charts and maps are actually talking about New Testament stuff, right? You'll have a map of Paul's journeys, or you'll have a map of Jerusalem at the time of Christ, or you'll have weights and measurements and stuff like that. But whenever you flip to the back of this Tanakh, what you'll see is a detailed analysis and all these charts explaining the laws of Moses, right? The laws that were given to the people of Israel. And that's because even to this day, these books right here are the building blocks of Jewish society, right? If you want to know how to live as a faithful Jew, you need to build your life upon these books, right? The back half of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. These things tell you how to function. They tell you what you're supposed to do. They tell you what makes a Jewish person. And so for us, whenever we look at these books and we find them boring, we're basically spitting in the face of God's revelation to man. Because these books are central in establishing who God is, who his people are, and how the Jewish people in particular were supposed to conduct themselves for a certain time period as they anticipated the arrival of the Messiah and the New Covenant, right? So we got to realize those books are super essential, right? And that's why they're in a thing all on their own. That is the Torah. But then you go from there, and you go to the 8 books of the prophets, the Nevi'im, and right off the bat, you'll notice that things start changing a little bit here. The first thing you'll notice is that whenever they refer to the prophets, they're referring to something a little bit different than what we are referring to whenever we say prophets. whenever we use the term prophets, as we're going to look at when we look at the Old Testament, we're usually referring to what the Jewish people would call the later prophets, right? Whenever we think of prophets, we're thinking of people who specifically are sent by God to a group of people to basically call them out and tell them to get their act together, or else God's going to send them into exile or something along those lines, right? So we think of people like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Jonah, Amos, Malachi, right? Those are the people we think of when we think of prophets. Jewish people think of it in a little bit different way, right? And so for them, whenever you go from the Torah, you next go into the section called the prophets, and this actually begins with Joshua. We usually treat the book of Joshua just like a book of history, but from the Jewish people's perspective, it actually classifies as a book of prophecy, right? Not because it's necessarily predicting the future or anything, but because the author himself is a prophet and he is writing during the time period of the prophets, right? This is the period of the early prophets, and you actually have 4 books at this time period. You have the book of Joshua, or Yehoshua. You have the book of Judges, or Shofetim. You have the book of Samuel, or Shemuel. And you have the book of Kings, which is Melachim, right? These are more or less what we would end up calling the historical books whenever we look at the Old Testament. But you'll notice right off the bat that this is where things start changing in order a little bit. Because whenever we read through the Old Testament, what book is missing from this list? Ruth, right? Yes, because if you're reading through the Old Testament, you've got Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, and then it goes to 1st and 2nd Samuel. You'll notice here that they've combined 1st and 2nd Samuel into Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings into Kings, and it's not really that they've combined them, it's more that we later on separated them, right? So originally Samuel was one book and Kings was one book, but we separated them to just make it easier to read so they weren't as long. But yeah, so we normally put Ruth between Judges and Samuel. They do not. And that's because Ruth is going to be reserved for a later section later on, right? Because from their perspective, Ruth actually fits into a different category. For us, the reason why we usually put Ruth in between Judges and Samuel is because that's where it fits chronologically in the timeline. And whenever it came to structuring our Old Testament, we kind of put chronology over most other things. And so we put Ruth in the time period of Judges before Samuel because Ruth is kind of the connective tissue between Judges and Samuel, right? It's set during the time period of the Judges, but it's a story that sets up the family line of David, right? And so that's why we put Ruth there, but they don't include that there. And so if you're reading through Genesis through Kings, what you have is you actually have a nice little chronological, like just narrative story that reads all the way from the creation of the world through the exile to Babylon, right? And so really, in those first 9 books right there, from Genesis through the early prophets, you actually have the whole story of the people of Israel up until the end of the Old Testament, right? That's really cool. But then, after we go from Kings, where do we usually go in our Old Testament? Yes, we go to Chronicles next. They save Chronicles for later on. We'll talk about why. But then after we go to Chronicles, what do we go to? Ezra, right? We go to Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther. Why? Once again, because those are historical books, and we fit them into the chronology, right? Ezra and Nehemiah detail the return from exile. Well, that's where Chronicles ends. Esther is set after the return from exile, and so, like in our Old Testament, we've structured it chronologically speaking, whereas for them, all of those books are reserved for later on, right? So they don't put Ezra and Nehemiah here, they don't put Esther here, they don't put Chronicles here. Instead, and they don't even put the books of poetry here, right? Because then we usually go to Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon. Those aren't here either, right? Instead, what they do is they go straight from Kings into Isaiah, right? Which we usually reserve for the end of the Old Testament. But I think it makes sense for them to put the later prophets here because as you go through the early prophets, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, towards the end of Kings, do you know who starts showing up? The later prophets, right? You have people like Isaiah and stuff showing up into the story, and they're getting on to the people of Israel, telling them that if they don't get their act right, God's going to send them into exile. And so, I think it fits that this is what you would have right here, right? So you've got the historical stories being told, and then, right whenever you have this story of them going off into exile, then you get to go dive deeper into how this actually happened, right? So if you're just narratively experiencing the story for the first time, you see the people go into exile, and you're saying, how could we have gotten here? And then you flip to Isaiah, and you get to see the whole story play out through the voice of the person who actually was calling them out, right? And then you go to Jeremiah, right? And Jeremiah is detailing the events leading to the actual destruction of Jerusalem. And then you go to Ezekiel, and Ezekiel is the person who is literally over in Babylon after the destruction, during the exile, and he's lamenting everything that happened, right? And so I think it makes more sense actually to go in this order. And then you have the book of the 12, right? Shneim Asar, right? This is what we would call the minor prophets, right? And so for us, whenever we have 12 separate books that we would call, Hosea, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, all those, we call those separate books. In the Hebrew Bible, they just call that one book, and that's called the book of the 12, right? And so that could explain why, you got 39 books in our Old Testament, 24 in theirs. Well, there's certain books that we split into 2 books, and there's also certain books that we split into 12 books that they just call one book, right? So they have the book of the 12, and there's a Hosea section, and there's an Amos section. But for them, it's one book, and it's treated as one book, right? And so there's how you have that. And so you have the 5 books of the Torah, the 8 books of the prophets, and then only after the 8 books of the prophets do you then get to the 11 books of the writings, which starts with the Sifrei Emet, which are the books of poetry, right? And so right after you get through the prophets and you finish Malachi, you flip to the Psalms, right? And if people are correct, and some people have suggested that the Psalms is basically producing a theology of the Messiah, I think this fits right after you have this prophecy of Malachi, who is saying that the prophet Elijah is going to show to pave the way of the Lord. So you flip to Psalms, and you get all these amazing songs that basically span the Jewish people's entire history, starting with Moses all the way to the time of the exile, right? And so from Genesis to the books of the 12, it's quite fitting. You have this book of Psalms, which gives you songs from that entire time period. And then you go to the book of Proverbs, which is man's instructions to his sons on how to live wisely and to not follow the path of folly, which is probably pretty fitting if you're people who have just returned from exile and who want to hear from the Lord and learn how to follow his path without getting exiled again. And then you have the book of Job, right? And the book of Job is probably one of the most fascinating books in the entire Old Testament, mainly because we don't know who wrote it, but it seems to be set way back during the time period of the book of Genesis. And it's really exploring the question of, why does God allow such horrible things to happen to his faithful people, right? Which is kind of interesting because you realize that the people of Israel just experienced this whole horrible thing where something bad happened to them, even though they'd been, because they'd been unfaithful, right? And so you have Job, who's almost like a contrast to the people of Israel at that time period. And so there's the books of poetry. And then from the books of poetry, you get to the 5 scrolls, which are the Hamesh Megillot, right? They're called the Megillot, the 5 scrolls, right? And this would be where you get some of the books that we skipped earlier, right? Song of Solomon, Ruth, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, Esther. And these books are unique because they're all fairly short books, right? Song of Solomon's 8 chapters, Ruth is 4 chapters, Lamentations is, I want to say 5 chapters, I kind of forget. Ecclesiastes is 12 chapters, Esther is, I believe, 10 chapters. They're all very short books. And whenever you actually encounter these books, what a lot of Jewish communities will do is they will read these books on certain specific Jewish holidays, right? So they'll gather together at the synagogue and they will read through these books because something about what that book teaches reflects something that they can reflect on during that specific holiday, right? And so you got the Song of Songs, Shir HaSharim, Ruth, Lamentations. I really love the name for Lamentations in Hebrew. It's the word Aicha, and it just means how, right? Because the book of Lamentations, we usually put it next to the book of Jeremiah, and that's because Jeremiah wrote the book of Lamentations. But the reason he wrote the book of Lamentations is because it's a lament. On the 9th of Av, in 586 BC, the Babylonians came in and they destroyed Jerusalem, right? And the book of Lamentations is a lament of that day. The 9th of Av, basically, for the Jewish people, is the equivalent of 9/11 for American people, right? To where the 9th of Av is this horrible day where these people came in and just destroyed them. But I would actually suggest that the 9th of Av is even worse for the Jewish people, because 9/11 for us is just a tragic event that took a lot of innocent lives, whereas the 9th of Av for them was divine punishment for their continued sin, right? So it was actually God himself who sent the Babylonians to destroy them. And so whenever you actually get to the Hebrew name for Lamentations in the Bible, it's just how, right? Like the name itself conveys all this emotion. Like, how did we get here? How could this have happened? How could Jerusalem be fallen? How could the temple be destroyed? So there's a lot of emotion just in the name. And then you have Ecclesiastes, which in Hebrew is called Kohelet, the name for the teacher. And then you have the book of Esther, which is named after Esther. And then the whole Tanakh concludes with 3 books of history, right? You have the book of Daniel, which we usually would lump together with Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, right? So they put Daniel at the very end, and then they put Ezra and Nehemiah at the end, and they have the book of Chronicles at the end. So whenever you get to the very end of this, you actually get to see them returning once again to like this whole chronological story that ended way back in Kings, right? So they went Genesis through Kings, and Kings kind of foreshadowed this return from exile. And then they had all this middle stuff that kind of reflected on the mindset of the Jewish people. And then at the very end of the Torah, what you get is you get the book of Daniel, which is detailing basically the story of how to be faithful to God while living in a pagan land. Right? Daniel is set during the exile while they're off in Babylon, and you actually get to see the Babylonians get overthrown by the Persians, and ultimately Daniel has all these visions of the future kingdom of God. Then you go to Ezra and Nehemiah, which are the story about the people returning back to the land to rebuild. And then what you have, which I really like, is that you have the book of Chronicles. And Chronicles is put at the very end here to recap the story. Because basically what Chronicles is it's a retelling of the story of Samuel and Kings, but it's specifically focused on the Messianic line. Right? So it's specifically focused on God's promises to David and specifically tracing the line of Judah. Right? So I actually really prefer how the Hebrew Bible is structured versus our Old Testaments, because I just think that if you're reading from it, like through it from cover to cover, it flows more naturally. Because like whenever we read through Samuel and Kings, then get to Chronicles, it's almost like you're just rereading the same story again, and you're like, why is this? But whenever you've read through everything, and then you get to Chronicles at the very end, it's kind of nice to have this refresher, and even the genealogies become more bearable. Because you're reading the genealogies and you're remembering, oh, I remember that, I remember that, I remember that, I remember that. And so it kind of refreshes you, and it ends the whole Old Testament with this kind of promise of hope that there will be this return from exile, which ultimately they already read about, right? And so it ends promising that they will return, and they've already seen that God is faithful to fulfill His promises, right? And so I actually really like how the Hebrew Bible is structured, and I actually prefer it over our Old Testament structure. But a few other things to just point out here. Like I've already mentioned, Samuel includes 1st and 2nd Samuel. Kings includes 1st and 2nd Kings. The book of the 12 includes Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. And then, over here, I'll put this next thing up too. Chronicles includes 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Here are the holidays that the Megillot are typically read at. Song of Songs is read at Passover. And each of these has different reasons, right? Song of Songs is read at Passover because Passover is celebrating God delivering His people from bondage. And basically, it's God wooing His people Israel, right? And He basically makes this amazing proposal to them at Mount Sinai and stuff like that. Well, that's kind of what Song of Songs is about, right? It's about this divine love that you get to see. Ruth is read at the Feast of Weeks, which we also know as Pentecost, right? And since that is since Pentecost is about the first fruits of harvesting and stuff like that, well, Ruth is about a woman who's literally out in the fields. Lamentations is read on the 9th of Av, right? Because that day is commemorating the destruction of Jerusalem. And so they read that and they lament the fall of Jerusalem. And then Ecclesiastes is read at Tabernacles, which is really fun because currently, as we are recording this, Tabernacles just began 2 nights ago, right? Today is October 1st. Yesterday is September 29th. And so September 9th marked the first day of the Feast of Tabernacles. But they would have begun on Friday night. And so in many Jewish communities on Friday night, they would have gathered together at their synagogue, and some of them would have read the entire book of Ecclesiastes, right? And that's to commemorate the Feast of Tabernacles. And then you have Esther being read at the Feast of Purim, and that's because the Feast of Purim is actually one of the official celebrations that the Jewish people celebrate that is not actually detailed in the Torah. Right? So you have Passover and weeks and tabernacles and stuff detailed in the Torah. Purim is not in the Torah, but the Feast of Purim actually comes from the book of Esther. Right? So if you remember at the end of the book of Esther, they basically led this revolt and they fought and stuff, and they won. And as a result of their victory, they established this new feast called Purim. And so Purim is celebrated to this day. It's basically the equivalent of like the Jewish Halloween. And they'll celebrate that, and they'll read the book of Esther. And so if you remember, like in The Chosen, they celebrated that, right? They celebrated that just at the end of season 3, right? And so there's the structure of the Hebrew Bible, of the Tanakh. Now what I want to do is I want to contrast that by how we've structured our Old Testaments. And so I kind of already mentioned that the way that we structure our Old Testament isn't nearly as satisfying to me, but from an aesthetic perspective and a symmetrical perspective, it actually is superior by far. And so the way that we have structured our Old Testaments is into 17 books of history, 5 books of poetry, and then 17 books of prophecy. Right off the bat, you'll notice the symmetry, right? 17, 5, 17. Of the 17 books of history, the first 5 books are the books of the Pentateuch, right? Which Pentateuch just means 5 books, right? These are the books of Moses, and they are equivalent to what the Jewish people call the Torah, right? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. For the 5 books of Moses at the very beginning of your Bible. So you start with the 5 books of the Pentateuch, and from there you go into the 12 other historical books. And like I already mentioned before, we usually favor chronology over everything else. And so kind of the way that we've structured this whole Old Testament is that if you read from Genesis through Esther, you can basically read a somewhat, more or less, continuous flow of the whole story of the Jewish people, right? Genesis tells you from the creation of the world to their arrival in Egypt, like the Jewish people's arrival in Egypt, or the people of Israel's arrival in Egypt. Exodus tells you about the people's enslavement in Egypt all the way to their, like God's coming to dwell with them in the tabernacle at Mount Sinai. Leviticus tells you about the laws they received at Mount Sinai. Numbers tells you about their wanderings in the wilderness from Sinai all the way to the edge of Moab. Deuteronomy details Moses' final oracles and speeches that he gave to them at Moab before he went up Mount Nebo and died. Joshua details them going from Moab into the land of Israel itself in order to actually conquer it, and that's where they conquer the land. Judges details the death of Joshua and the resulting falling away and almost apostasy of the people of Israel as they turned away from God when there was no king in Israel. Ruth tells you about a story that took place during that time period. If anything, it's almost like a spin-off, right? So you have the book of Judges going on over here, and then there's a side story of Ruth. And Ruth tells you the story of this one faithful woman, who was living during an unfaithful time. And through her faithfulness came King David, right? And then you go to 1st and 2nd Samuel, and you get to read the birth of the monarchy, right? 1st and 2nd Samuel goes to 1st and 2nd Kings, right? And 1st and 2nd Kings tells you the decline of the monarchy, right? So in 1st and 2nd Samuel, you read about Saul and David, and you have this united monarchy established. 1st and 2nd Kings tells you about Solomon, and after Solomon, the kingdom's divided, and eventually the kingdom falls away to where it starts looking a lot more like the book of Judges until everything collapses. And 2nd Kings ends with the people going off into exile, and then there's a tiny little promise of return. 1st and 2nd Chronicles tells the same story, right? So it just kind of repeats it, kind of like how we put Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John together in the Bible. Well, we put Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles together. It just retells the story. Ezra and Nehemiah details the people returning from exile to rebuild. And then the book of Esther details a story going on over in Persia involving a Jewish family that decided not to return, right? Because after the exile, once the Jewish people were allowed to return, some of them just decided to stay away. And Esther belongs to that group of people. And so that right there is the structure of the books of history. And we've kind of just put them in a historically flowing manner, right? So we're just chronologically speaking, you go from Genesis through Esther. You start with the earliest that the Old Testament goes back, and the book of Esther ends with the latest that the Old Testament goes, right? So it goes from the beginning to the end, right? Then we go to the 5 books of poetry, right? This would be the book of Job, then Psalms, then Proverbs, then Ecclesiastes, and then Song of Songs. It just so happens that whenever you write these out in English, they make a nice little pyramid. So these are the books that sometimes we would call them the wisdom literature. They're dealing with different aspects of things. Really, the wisdom literature is specifically Job, Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes. But sometimes you would include Psalms and Song of Solomon in there as well. Job is dealing with really the question of suffering and how exactly God, how to view suffering in this sinful, broken world, and what God's role is in it, what Satan's role is in it, what man's role is in it. It's just exploring that concept. Psalms is a collection of songs. Proverbs is, once again, wisdom. Ecclesiastes is exploring the meaning of life. Song of Solomon is about romance. And so we put those in the very center of our Old Testaments. And I think that makes sense, right? Because if the Bible is supposed to teach us how to live faithfully, I think it makes sense that these 5 books would find themselves at the very center of our Bibles, right? Because these are it's about teaching you how to be faithful to God, right? It's teaching you how to respond properly in light of various things in life. And then our Old Testaments end with the books of prophecy. You have the 5 major prophets followed by the 12 minor prophets, right? The 5 major prophets would be Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, and Daniel. And whenever we call them major prophets, we're not calling them major because they're more important. We're calling them major because they're longer, right? That's primarily true for Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. Lamentations is mainly lumped in there because it's written by Jeremiah, and so we just put it in there with the major prophets. And then Daniel is also put there because it's kind of longer, but if I'm being entirely honest, it seems like we just didn't know where else to put it, and so we put it in the one place that would make everything symmetrical. And also Daniel and Ezekiel were written around the same time, so it does kind of make sense to put those together. But if you're reading Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, Daniel, you actually do have a chronological flow there as well, because Isaiah is writing near the beginning of the arrival of the later prophets, right? So he is warning them about the coming exile. Jeremiah is writing during the time of the exile. Ezekiel's writing a little bit after the time of the exile, and Daniel's writing during the exile, right? So those do kind of chronologically work their way out. And then at the very end, we have the 12 minor prophets, which is Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, right? So these are the books that the Jewish people would call the book of the 12. And so if you're just looking at it, you can see what I mean whenever I say that we have organized this very symmetrically to where, like, you just look at it and it's very nice, right? So you've got, like, going just across the top, 5, 5, 5. At the bottom, you got 12, 12. You got 5, 12, 5, 5, 12. Like, it just fits very nicely together. And so I think there is something really beautiful about this. But whenever it comes to actually reading through it, like, cover to cover, I still just have to say that I prefer the Hebrew Bible's order. I've read through it both ways. And to me, I feel like I got more out of it. I mean, ultimately, you should be able to get the same out of it both ways. But just reading through it, like, without doing deep study, like, just reading through it, like, there was literally a time where I would literally go on my run, and go on runs, and I would literally just listen to the Old Testament. And I listened to the entire Hebrew Bible in that order, and I just really liked it. To where it was just really riveting, and it was actually kind of exciting. And I know the Bible doesn't exist to entertain us, but I was entertained the entire time. Like, I just felt like it flowed more naturally. But that's the structure of the Old Testament, right? So there's the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament. It's the same content, we just separate it differently. Do you all have any questions?
I got a question about the last book of poetry.
Okay.
Sometimes we call it Song of Solomon, and other times we call it Song of Songs. Is there any reason why that is?
Not really. Basically, the very first verse of the book is the Song of Songs, which is Solomon's. And so people will just kind of call it either way. It just kind of depends on preference. What you have to realize is that these books, when they were originally written, they're not written like normal, like books nowadays. Where nowadays, whenever we write a book, the author will write the book, and then they'll just slap a title on the cover. They'll put their name on the cover and everything, and they'll publish it. That's not how these books were written. These books were written, and it was just the content of the book. The people did not put their names, like the authors didn't put their names on them. They did not give it a title. They usually just wrote the book. And then there was people later on who gave them the title. And that's why I was even highlighting that Jewish people, they call it different stuff, right? And so the Jewish name for it is Song of Songs. So that's kind of what I prefer. But you can call it the Song of Songs or the Song of Solomon. Either way. So, yeah. All right, New Testament. Unfortunately, the structure of the New Testament is not nearly as pretty as the Old Testament. But basically what you have is you have 5 books of history, 13 Pauline epistles. Pauline epistles refers to the books that were written by Paul. And then the general epistles, there's 8 of them, and general epistles refers to the books that are written by somebody other than Paul. And then you have 1 book of prophecy, which in a way could kind of fit into the general epistles, because the book of Revelation ultimately, it actually is an epistle. It is actually a letter that is being written to the 7 churches of Asia Minor. and it actually includes epistles within the epistle. But yeah, and really, Revelation is hard to categorize because it kind of fits into historical books and general epistles, and also just prophecy. And so it's kind of weird. And so when you're walking through it, you have the 5 books of history: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and then you also have Acts. What do we call Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John?
The Gospels.
These are the Gospels, right? These are the 4 Gospels, and these 4 Gospels are ultimately just telling about the life of Jesus, and they're kind of comparable to Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles because there is some overlap in them. And really, specifically, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are very similar. Do you know what we call those 3?
No.
So Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called the Synoptic Gospels
Oh,
because the Synoptic Gospels, they look very similar, right? So Matthew, Mark, and Luke, like if you're actually comparing certain texts, sometimes they're almost word for word. It's actually really interesting. So scholars debate a lot about that, and eventually we'll talk about the synoptic problem later on when we're doing this. But Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, those are the Gospels. And then you have the book of Acts, and Acts actually is a sequel to which one of those Gospels?
Luke?
Luke. Yes, because Acts was written by Luke, and even in his opening, like in his introduction, he admits that the book of Acts is a sequel. Like he says, hey, you've read the first book. And so some people in the early church actually put Luke and Acts next to each other, and I actually kind of like that because they really are companion pieces. But those are the 5 books of history. And then from there you go into the Pauline epistles, and there's 13 of them. Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus, and Philemon. How do you think that these books are organized? Because they're not organized alphabetically.
Chronologically?
You would think, because honestly, that would make the most sense to me. But what they actually did here is they actually organized these by length, right? And so whenever you're actually looking at these, they're organized by length. Romans is the longest of the Pauline epistles. It's 16 chapters long, and Philemon's only 1 chapter, right? And so when you're reading through them, it's actually organized by length, and this actually makes sense. If you just think about ancient scribal practices, you have to remember that they had to copy all this stuff by hand. And so it makes more sense to start with the longer books, because if you're trying to preserve paper and you're trying to not waste paper, what you do is you copy down the longer books first, so that if you only have a little bit of space left, you can copy down Philemon. But if you only have a limited amount of space and you need to copy down the entire book of Romans at the end, well, then you're out of luck, right? And so what they would do is they'd start with the longer books, and then they'd move to the shorter ones. But if you were to actually read through this, chronologically speaking, it would actually probably be more likely in the order of 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, Galatians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Romans, and then from there you would go to Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, Philemon, 1st and 2nd Timothy, and then Titus, right? Well, actually, no, 1st Timothy, Titus, and then 2nd Timothy, right? And so if you were to go through this chronologically speaking, you would actually be all over the place, and that's worth highlighting because you just got to realize that it can be a little bit jarring if you're reading through the New Testament cover to cover, because Paul is writing to different people while he's in different circumstances, right? Romans and 1st and 2nd Corinthians were all written around the same time period, but when you get to Galatians, that was written a lot earlier. And then whenever you read Ephesians, Philippians, and Colossians, those were written around the same time period, but they were written a lot later in Paul's life whenever he's in prison. You go to 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, that was probably the earliest of Paul's letters, and that's written whenever he was a free man, right? Then you go to 1st Timothy, and he's free again, but it's way later in his life. And then you go to 2nd Timothy, and he's about to die, and he's in prison again. But then you go to Titus, and he's free again, and he's out traveling apparently, and that was probably around the time he was writing 1st Timothy. But then you go to Philemon, and heck, he's in prison again, but this is way back when he was writing Ephesians, Philippians, and Colossians. Right, so if you're just reading through these, like cover to cover, it can be a bit confusing because it's all over the place. Mm-hmm. But it's just organized by length, right? So Romans is the longest, 1 Corinthians is the second longest, and we put 2 Corinthians with 1 Corinthians because they're written to the same church, right? And then after that, Galatians is the longest, and then you have Ephesians, then you have Philippians, then you have Colossians, and then 1 Thessalonians, but 2 Thessalonians is put there because it's written to the same church. And then you keep going that way through it, and that's ultimately why those are organized the way that they are. And all of Paul's epistles are named after the person that he is writing to, right? Because if it was just called, it was named after him, there would be 1st Paul, 2nd Paul, 3rd Paul. There would be 13 Pauls. That would be way too long, right? And so we name them after the books that the people he was writing to, whereas in contrast, the general epistles are named after the people that wrote them, right? With the exception of Hebrews. And the reason why Hebrews is found first is because, historically speaking, people have always debated about who the author was. In the earliest evidence that we have, people actually always lumped Hebrews together with the books of Paul, right? And so it seems like a lot of the early church seemed to think that Paul was the author of Hebrews, but a lot of people would debate about that. I'm kind of caught in the middle. I love debating with Stratton about this because he vehemently thinks that Paul was not the author of Hebrews, whereas I kind of lean towards it. But Hebrews is just a weird book. It's the one book of the New Testament we do not know who wrote it. And so we just kind of put it right there in the middle to where it could be Paul's, it could be somebody else's. All the other books, though, are named after the person who wrote them, right? And so James was written by James. 1st and 2nd Peter, written by Peter. 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, written by John. Jude was written by Jude, right? And once again, those are organized according to length, right? Like length first, and then also the person who wrote it, right? So James is the longest, and then 1st Peter is the second longest, and then 2nd Peter is put with 1st Peter. 1st John is the longest of John's letters, and then 2nd and 3rd John are lumped there with it, and then you get to Jude. And then at the very end, you have the book of Revelation, which is once again written by the Apostle John, right? And so New Testament is not structured nearly as beautifully as the Old Testament is. I kind of wish that we would reconfigure the letters and just put them in chronological order, because I think it would make more sense. Whereas I was kind of arguing against the chronological order thing in the Old Testament. I just think it makes more sense. To me, I've tried, that's what we're doing, with the discipleship group. Before we did this, we were reading through the books of the New Testament in chronological order, because for me, I like seeing the maturation of the church and seeing the different issues that were needing to be addressed as the church grew, right? Because you have to realize that all these books, the 39 books of the Old Testament, were written over the course of 1,000 years. The 27 books of the New Testament were written over the course of 50 years, right? That's a 20th of the time, right? And so these books are a lot closer together, and so if you're just actually reading through them in chronological order, it's actually really cool. You can actually see the development of concerns and problems in the church itself. And so this is one of those places where I kind of wish that we would do it a little bit differently, but I see why they did it the way that they did. So those are the broad scoping, big picture stuff when it comes to the structure of the books. Now what I want to do is I want to also help out, just help you out when it comes to understanding how the books themselves fit together. Specifically because you remember how I mentioned the Old Testament, you have those 17 historical books, right? And basically the other 22 books that we have in the Old Testament, they all somewhere fit chronologically into those 17 historical books, right? Because if you read Genesis through Esther, you've got the whole history of the Old Testament, and all those other books fit into that. So what I want to do now is I want to actually look at how those books fit into it, right? And so we're going to start off with an overview of the monarchy. On the left side over here, you've got the books of history, and you've got the books of poetry. And then across the top, you can divide everything into the united monarchy and the divided monarchy, right? This isn't proportional, right? Because the united monarchy only lasted about 120 years, right? You have Saul, you have David, and you have Solomon, each of whom reigned about 40 years each, right? So you have 120 years in total. And that was from 1050 BC to 930 BC. And then you have the divided monarchy, which actually lasted nearly 400 years, from 930 BC to 586 BC, right? So this is kind of just the overall historical perspective of these books. And you start off with this one line of 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings, right? 1st and 2nd Samuel tells primarily the story of David, but 1st Samuel can actually be viewed as telling 3 stories, right? It tells basically it's the transition. Right, 1 Samuel tells you how we got from the judges, right? So you have Samuel, the final judge, to the monarchy with Saul, to eventually the Davidic dynasty with David, right? That's 1 Samuel, and it basically talks about the decline of the period of the judges and the rise of David. And then you get to 2 Samuel, where David is actually king, right? So that's all 1 and 2 Samuel. And then you go into 1 Kings, and The first 11 chapters of 1 Kings talk about the reign of Solomon, right? And then 1 Kings 12 through the end of 2 Kings talks about the divided kingdom, because the year that Solomon dies and the year that his kingdom goes to his son Rehoboam, there's this huge split. And the kingdom splits into two nations. You've got the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. 1st and 2nd Kings tells that story. And so, we call it Samuel and Kings, but if we were to give them modern names, like if somebody were to write these books nowadays and give them a fancy name, I imagine that we would probably title Samuel something along the lines of The Rise of the Kingdom, and 1st and 2nd Kings would be called The Fall of the Kingdom, right? That's probably what we would call it, because that's kind of the trajectory of those books. And then, through there, you also have 1st and 2nd Chronicles being written, right? And 1st Chronicles is basically an editorial on the life of David, right? So 1st Chronicles is basically retelling the story of 1st and 2nd Samuel, but it's specifically focused on the person of David himself, right? So it will mention some of the other people, but it will only mention them insofar as it advances the story of David, right? So whenever you're reading it, you'll notice that certain things are highlighted, certain things are skipped over, and that's because it's primarily highlighting the high points. Like, one of the craziest things to me is in 1st Chronicles, it'll talk about that moment whenever all the kings would go out into war, right? And how David stayed home at his palace. And if you've read 2 Samuel, you know what happens next, right? He ends up sleeping with Bathsheba, and his life just starts falling apart. 1st Chronicles skips that, right? It just tells you that David stayed home, and then it moves on to something else. It does not highlight David's sin, because it's specifically focusing on the Davidic dynasty and how God blessed it, right? And so it's not focused on all the dirty details and nasty stuff that 1st and 2nd Samuel are talking about. It's specifically focused on the high points. Then you go to 2nd Chronicles, and in 2nd Chronicles, you're specifically focused on an editorial of the people of Judah, right? I mentioned how in Kings, you have the kingdom split into two, right? The northern kingdom is Israel, the southern kingdom is Judah. And 2nd Chronicles specifically focuses on Judah. If you go to 1st and 2nd Kings, it's kind of confusing. We're going to be going through that in our Bible study group, so we're going to have to deal with the confusion. But once you get to the divided kingdom, it always goes back and forth. It says, here's what's going on in Israel. Here's what's going on in Judah. Here's what's going on in Israel. Here's what's going on in Judah. Whereas in 2nd Chronicles, you don't have that. In 2nd Chronicles, it's specifically focusing on the people of Judah, right? And that's because it's tracing the Messianic line, right? It starts with David, and God makes this covenant to David, and therefore when you get to 2nd Chronicles, you get to see how God is fulfilling that covenant despite David's family's failures, right? And so 1st and 2nd Chronicles fits into Samuel and Kings. And then when you get to the books of poetry, you got the book of Psalms, which is primarily associated with David. I mentioned earlier how the Psalms really is a collection of songs that date way back to the time period of Moses all the way to the time period of the exile. But almost half of those Psalms are written by David, and that's why we mainly associate it with him. Right? You remember that David at the end of 2 Samuel is called the sweet psalmist of Israel. Right? At least, I think it's 73 of the Psalms, 73 of the 150 Psalms that we have are attributed to David. Most of those are found in the first half of the book of Psalms. But there's also some others littered throughout. And really, it just seems like most of them are associated with him, and so we kind of can associate the Psalms with that time period. But then you have Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon being associated specifically with Solomon and the people who followed him, right? And you might even be able to kind of figure out when in Solomon's life he might have written some of these books, right? But those books are very fitting for the people of Israel during this time period whenever the kingdom is divided, because they're exploring how to live life wisely and how to walk according to the fear of the Lord, which the people of Israel were not doing, right? And so if you're wanting to see how those books fit into it, that's how it would work there. But then things become even more complicated whenever you talk about the prophets, right? Because these prophets can be, like whenever you're talking about all the prophets that we have, those 17 books of the prophets that were on the far end of the Old Testament outline I had there, these 17 books can be split into 3 different categories according to chronology. Do you have any guesses on what those 3 categories would be? So what are the earliest prophets warning the people about?
The judgment of God if they sin.
The judgment of God, specifically, what is God going to do to them?
Was it exiling?
He's going to send them into exile, right? So you have some prophets who are showing up and they're warning the people about exiling them, God exiling them, and then God actually does it. And you have some prophets who are writing during that time period, And then eventually God sends them back from exile, and you have prophets who are writing afterwards, right? And so, by and large, those 17 prophets can be broken into 3 categories: pre-exile, exile, and post-exile, right? Those are the 3 categories we're dealing with when it comes to prophets. It starts with the pre-exilic prophets, and this is where we've got most of them, and I think that makes sense, right? Because God is gracious, right? And yes, he's going to judge the people, but he is going to give them so many opportunities to repent, right? And so during this time period, which is from 850 to 586 BC, basically you have God sending a bunch of prophets to the people to basically warn them, right? In 930 BC, the kingdom was divided, and you have people just going more and more away from God, right? So eventually God sends prophets to get onto them. In the northern kingdom, you have 2 prophets being sent. You've got a prophet named Hosea and a prophet named Amos. They both go to the northern kingdom of Israel to get onto them and just like yell at them and say, hey, get your act together, and really just try to get them to repent. However, that ultimately is not going to totally work out for them because the Assyrians are going to come in 722 BC and destroy them, and that's why you can see that little red mark next to the sign, right? Because those people are going to be destroyed. The northern kingdom is going to be wiped off the face of the map. Like, they're just gone, right? Meanwhile, you've got God also sending a bunch of prophets to the royal line of David, right? To the southern kingdom of Judah. And these prophets include Habakkuk, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Joel, Micah, Zephaniah, and then Jeremiah also wrote another book called Lamentations, right? And so all these books are written to the people of Judah, trying to get them to repent, or else God is going to destroy them as well, which ultimately happens whenever the Babylonians come in 586 BC on the 9th of Av and take them into exile. And that's what the book of Lamentations is about, right? And so those are what how all those prophets fit together. But then you have 3 other pre-exilic prophets, 2 of whom are Jonah and Nahum, right? And they are both sent to the people of Assyria, right? And the people of Assyria were mainly the big bad guys during most of this time period, right? The Assyrians were the big bad guys. They're eventually the ones who are going to wipe out the people of Israel, and they're going to come very close to wiping out the people of Judah, but then King Hezekiah is going to repent last second, and God's going to send the Assyrians away, right? So the Assyrians are big bad guys during this time period. I think it makes sense for God to send some prophets to them as well. The way that you can remember the prophets that were sent to Assyria is because you'll notice that both of them have N-A-H in their name, and you'll remember how the conversation between God and Jonah went. God said, go to Nineveh, and Jonah said, nah. He did not want to go, right? And so if you want to remember the prophets that were sent to Assyria, just remember they have nah in their name, right? Jonah and Nahum. Then you have one other prophet who is sent to the place called Edom. Do y'all know what Edom, like what's the significance of Edom? Who is Edom descended from?
People of Esau?
The people of Esau, yes, right? Remember Esau, his name is eventually Edom because Edom means red, right? Remember he had red hair. He sold his birthright for the red stew, right? And so the name means red, right? And sure enough, Edom is located in southern area of Jordan, right? So if you can imagine Israel on a map, just to the east across the Jordan River is the country of Jordan to this day. And if you go just south of the Dead Sea area, that would be the region of Edom, right? Nowadays, there's this very famous area of red rock canyons there called Petra, right? I believe, didn't Bailey say that they're going to Petra whenever they're there? Yeah, so that is the land of Edom, right? If you've seen Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, they go to Petra, right? I've been there. Also in the Transformers movies, they go to Petra, right? It's beautiful red rocks. That's the land of Edom, right? And the reason why Obadiah is sent to Obed-Edom is because Esau and Jacob were brothers, right? And therefore, Israel and Edom are spiritual brothers. And Edom had not been helping out the people of Israel in their time of need. And therefore, God sends Obadiah to Edom to get onto them and tell them, hey, you should have helped your brother out, right? And so it's actually really interesting because if you look at Obadiah, you can actually get to see what God expected of the Gentile, well, I guess it's not necessarily Gentile, but you get to see what God expected of the nations who weren't adhering to the law, right? So he wasn't expecting them to follow the law of Moses, but he still expected certain things of them, right? It's the whole like divine attributes that you can just perceive from nature, right? And so that's the pre-exile, and these would be during the time period of like 1st and 2nd Kings, and then 2nd Chronicles, right? Then you go to the time period of the exile, and you have 2 books being written, and they're being written around the same time period. You got the book of Ezekiel, and you have the book of Daniel, right? Ezekiel is actually really interesting. It's a really long book, a lot of weird visions. Both of these have really weird visions in them. I don't know what they were putting in their food over in Babylon, but these guys were tripping in some weird stuff. I'm joking, obviously. But Ezekiel and Daniel, you'll notice that both of them have L at the end of their names. That L means God, right? And Ezekiel and Daniel, they're both writing to the people during exile, and it's really cool because Ezekiel actually mentions Daniel in his book, despite the fact that they're living at the same time period. And the way that Ezekiel talks about Daniel is that he esteems him as one of the most righteous men to have ever lived. Which is I just think that's really cool that you have a prophet during, like, living at the same time period as one another who are acknowledging each other like that. So that's during the exile, whenever the people are off and they've already been sent off. And like I mentioned, Israel's gone at this point, right? The Assyrians destroyed Israel, and then eventually the Babylonians came in 586 BC and took the people off into exile. And you'll notice down here, it says 590 to 445 BC. The exile itself was specifically prophesied to be 70 years, but people will debate about exactly which those years are, because it was a little bit longer than that because it was done in waves. Right? There were actually 3 deportations out to Babylon, and then there were actually 3 returns. Right? So there's different waves of these. Like, it wasn't all just like one going out and then one coming back in. It was actually a little bit more fluid than that. And so the exile is during this entire time period. And then at the very end, you have the post-exilic prophets. This is set during the time period of 3 historical books. You have Ezra and Nehemiah. And then what other historical book do you have occurring here? What comes after Ezra and Nehemiah in our Old Testament? Esther.
Okay,
Yeah, because eventually, at the very end of the book of Daniel, what you read about is you actually read about the Babylonians being overthrown by the Medo-Persians, right? Darius the Mede comes in and overthrows Babylon. You remember that was the whole, like, where the handwriting shows up on the walls as Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin. Basically, Daniel says, oh, y'all are screwed. Y'all are, like, getting destroyed tonight, right? And then the Medo-Persians come in, they destroy Babylon. And the Persians had a different mindset whenever it came to how they took over people. The Babylonians would basically overtake people and disperse them to, like, take away their power. Whereas the Persians, their mentality was more like, we want to rule, but we want to be liked. And so what they said is, we don't want to take you away from your land. We want you to live in your land and just, like, we'll rule peacefully, right? And so whenever the Persians take over, you have this guy named Cyrus who sends them back and says, hey, y'all can go back to your land and you can go return there. And so Ezra and Nehemiah, they detail the people going back into the land and rebuilding, the temple and rebuilding the walls and stuff like that. But then there were some people who decided to stay away, right? And Esther is one of those people. Esther is living off in Persia, and she's one of the still dispersed Jews who ends up actually having this amazing story where she ends up becoming like the queen and stuff like that. But during this time period, you also have some prophets who are being sent to basically talk to the people at that time period. You have Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. Zechariah has a bunch of really cool kind of trippy visions. He talks about the king riding on the donkey into the holy city. And then you have Malachi, who basically is telling the people that even though they've returned from exile, they haven't fully returned to the Lord. And that they need to get their acts together because God does want to do something for them. But he ultimately prophesies that they're not really going to get their acts together until Elijah the prophet shows up and gets their hearts ready for the Messiah. And so that's how those books end. And so ultimately, that's how all those books, in the end, fit together. And that would be just how they all fit together in the Old Testament. When it comes to the New Testament, you can kind of do the same thing, because I mentioned how there were those 5 historical books at the very beginning. You had Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Acts, and then some of the epistles fit into those as well, right? And so on the left side, you can have the books of history, and then you have the epistles, right? And then along the top, you can separate basically the entire New Testament into 3 categories, right? You have the life of Christ, you have the early church, and then you have the early church like post-Acts, right? And the way this works is that you have 5 books of history. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are all set during the life of Christ. So they detail events going from about 5 BC till about AD 30. Some people say AD 33. I'd lean towards AD 30. Right? Then you have the book of Acts, which details really the following 32 years. Right? Stretching from the ascension of Christ all the way to Paul's arrival in Rome to be imprisoned. And then you have post-Acts, which basically covers the next 38 years from Paul's arrival in prison to the death of John at whatever point he actually died, which some people speculate to be at the end of the first century. And so those are the three categories of history that we can talk about here. But whenever it comes to the epistles, this is how we look at them. It really all starts in the book of Acts. You have to realize whenever you're reading all the letters that you find in the New Testament, none of them are written during the time period of Jesus' first advent on earth, right? So I remember I was talking with my students last year, and there were times where they'd be like, well, why didn't people just go ask Jesus about this? Well, that's because Jesus wasn't around when these letters were being written, right? Jesus, he was here and he left, and he was not actually here for the establishment of the church. Remember, he left so that they could send the Holy Spirit to be there, to actually equip the apostles to do it. So if anything, Jesus himself was living by faith, that the apostles would actually be faithful to their calling, right? And so, whenever you actually get to the early church time period, you really don't have any letters seemingly being written until persecution begins to grow in the church, right? To where everybody starts dispersing. And the earliest book that we have is the book of James, most likely, when it comes to the letters. And this is written either to dispersed Christians or possibly just dispersed Jews. To where James is the most Jewish-looking just New Testament book that we have, right? And it's set during this time period to where you can almost like all of these books that you see right here, the early epistles, hypothetically speaking, you could read through the book of Acts, and at certain key moments, you could pause the book of Acts and go read a letter that was probably written around that time period, which I think is kind of cool, right? And so you have James, who is writing this first book, and he's being the pastor of the church over in Jerusalem. And then you have Paul writing some books as well, right? 1st and 2nd Thessalonians and Galatians are written during what we would call Paul's second missionary journey, where he's traveling around with Silas and Timothy. And then you have 1st and 2nd Corinthians and Romans, which are written during Paul's third missionary journey, also with Silas and Timothy, right? And so it seems like those are when all those take place, and that's from AD 45 to AD 60. Eventually, though, Paul is thrown in prison in Jerusalem, and he's taken off to Caesarea, and from AD 60 to 62, he is imprisoned in Caesarea, right? And then, at the very end of Acts, you have Paul being taken out of prison in Caesarea, and he is shipped over to Rome, and the book of Acts ends with Paul arriving in Rome, where he is going to be imprisoned for 2 years. And so that's where the book of Acts ends. And you have to realize that everything after that, when it comes to our historical understanding of the early church, we basically get from the letters themselves, and we have to piece the information together. The cool thing, though, is that where the book of Acts ends, the prison epistles begin, right? Because during Paul's 2-year imprisonment in Rome, he writes 4 books: Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon. Right? These 4 books are written around the same time period, and if you actually read these side by side, you'll actually notice a lot of very similar things that he's addressing. You can tell that he wrote these very close together, like his mind was on the same thing. Right? So he's writing these from about AD 62 to AD 64. And then, eventually what happens is that Paul is set free from prison, presumably, and he writes 2 more books while he is free. Right? And these belong to what we call the pastoral epistles. But really there's 3 books, one of which was written when he's put in prison again, right? These would be Titus, 1 Timothy, and 2 Timothy. And the reason they're called pastoral epistles is because, on one hand, Paul is writing to men who are functioning as pastors, right? Because the word pastor means shepherd, right? Timothy is functioning as a pastor of the church in Ephesus, and Titus is functioning as a pastor of the church in Crete. But on the other hand, Paul is actually writing in a very pastoral sense. He is taking care of his own sheep. Right? He's taking care of his children in the faith. And so they're pastoral in the sense of he's acting as a shepherd to shepherds. Right? Whereas the prison epistles are named prison epistles because he's in prison. Right? He is in prison again in 2 Timothy, but it falls into the pastoral epistles. During the same time period, you also have the general epistles being written. Right? Hebrews We don't know who wrote that. And Hebrews is actually interesting because it seems to be less of an epistle and it seems to be more of a sermon, right? So it actually might be one of our first evidences of just literally a manuscript of a sermon being written out. And then you have 1st and 2nd Peter, which are probably being written towards the end of Peter's life, probably around the same time period that Paul's writing the pastoral epistles. And then you have Jude, which is probably written around the same time period as 2nd Peter. And then you have 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John and Revelation all being written near the end of the 1st century, right? So John seems to have waited a long time to write his stuff, and most people would agree that he wrote it near the end of the 1st century, probably as he was getting closer to dying. And also, I want to highlight that the historical books up there, I'm not saying that those are when those books are written. I'm just saying those are when the events of those books take place, right? We'll talk about when they were written later on. Okay, so there's that. And now the last thing I want to cover when it comes to the structure of the Bible, and then we're going to shift into something else, is I want to just give you some random Bible facts that really aren't that important in any way whatsoever. I just thought they were kind of fun to share with you. And so, there are 66 books in the Bible. There are 1,189 chapters in the Bible. And there are 31,102 verses in the entire Bible. I think some of y'all might remember whenever I read the entire Bible, one chapter a day, every day. And it took me 3.5 years to get through it. Specifically, it took me 1,189 days. Right? So that's kind of fun. But to go even more in depth, there are 39 books in the Old Testament and 27 books in the New Testament. There are 929 chapters in the Old Testament and 260 chapters in the New Testament. There are 23,145 verses in the Old Testament, and there are 7,957 verses in the New Testament. And then, when it comes to the Old Testament authors, there are 27 known authors and 5 or more unknown authors. Right? There are some authors where we just don't know for sure who wrote it. People just have theories. The New Testament, there are 8 known authors, and there's 1 unknown author. Right? The 8 known authors would be Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. Let's see if I can do these all. Okay. Paul, Peter, Jude, and James. Right? Those would be the 8 known authors, and then the 1 unknown one would be the author of Hebrews, which could have been one of those 8, or it could be somebody else. It took about 1,000 years to write the Old Testament, somewhere between 700 to 1,100 years, depending on where you kind of date those things. Meanwhile, it only took about 50 years to write the New Testament, which really is just crazy whenever you think about it. You have 1,000 years to write all these books that are really dedicated to just one small people group living in this tiny land. Whereas by contrast, you have 50 years to write these books, go like to this new movement that is like spanning the entire Roman Empire. Right? It's actually a huge flip-flop. The Old Testament language, the Old Testament was primarily written in Hebrew, but there's a little bit of it that's also written in Aramaic. Meanwhile, the New Testament was written in Koine Greek, and Koine means common, right? So there's different types of Greek. Koine was the common tongue, right? It wasn't sophisticated Greek, it was just the tongue of the common people. And then the basis of the Old Testament was prophetic authority, while the basis of the New Testament was apostolic authority. There you go. There is the structure of the Old and New Testament in the Bible. Do y'all have any questions about any of that? All right, cool. What we're going to do now is I'm going to switch to a different PowerPoint, and if y'all are watching this video online, this is where the video is going to end. And what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the origin of the Bible, and so we're going to do that real quick, and we will see y'all next time.